Hey everyone, this is lesson 1 for the RRStudio class that me and Kooks are running.
The short version is I make the content and AK makes sure this class actually functions. So today we'll be doing lesson 1, which is just your first upload. How do we actually get RRStudio up and running and ready to upload something? The basic way that we'll run these sessions, we haven't had a previous session yet, but in future sessions I'll have a quick recap. Then I'll launch into the session. We'll go through the main content reasonably quickly, but the rest of the session will be dedicated to me just helping you out with any difficulties you may find along the way. After we've done the main session content, there'll be a homework piece. So the homework in question will be that we're gonna grab a little scene like this to start with. These 4 that I found lying around, and if you want to pick one of these 4 to build, I would recommend it because I will be finding assets for you to work with that will let us make one of these 4 scenes. We've got ourselves a nice little forest scene, we've got a beach scene, we've got a mountain scene, and we've got a desert scene. But if you want to use something else as your reference scene, I definitely won't stop you. So one thing that is not strictly studio related, but the way that we have our Discord channels structured for this class, just about everything you need to run through the lesson will be in the notes and resources forum. If you run into any sort of problems, this time it's called homework help rather than need help. But anything you run into, any just general studio questions you have that we didn't cover in class, anything you want to know in general, you can open a post in the homework help channel and I will get to it as I can. So the topics we'll be going over in today's lesson, just the basics of the editor. If you've used something similar before, it should be fairly intuitive, but if you haven't, we'll go through all the basics. Importing images is often something that people want to do right off the bat. You can import yourself a nice little profile picture. We'll be going over the orange and the white scene, which is one of the fundamental mechanics that makes Studio different to regular Unity things. A brief overview of how we manage rooms in Studio, but it's nice and simple. How we work with prefabs, and also finally actually uploading our first scene into Rec Room from Studio. So to give you a brief introduction to the panels that we have in our Unity UI. So we have our hierarchy panel that generally lives to the left. Now I have this broken up by the section of the editor that they live in. So there are other things that can left, there are other things that can live right or down the bottom. You can in fact drag any of these to any place, but this is where they live by default, and this is what I'll be referring to them as in the future. So you can see we've got our hierarchy panel on the left-hand side. It's a big old collapsible list of everything that is in our viewport over here, our scene. Our project panel generally lives down the bottom, and it is a folder view of all of the assets that we have, both in our project folder and in the packages that Rec Room provided us with. And finally, the inspector generally lives on the right, and it will show us details about any given thing that we have selected, both in the project panel and in the hierarchy panel. Real basic moving around of things in Studio. If you left click, you will select things. If you right click and hold right click, it will make you look around. And if you press WASD while you're holding right click, you'll move. Our basic tools for manipulating things look very similar to the roughly equivalent make pen controls. So we have our move, we have our rotate, we have our scale. And this funny little thing called a rectangle select, which is effectively manipulate, but it only works on one 2D plane at a time. Probably the most confusing little set of controls we have here is the one that actually surrounds the scene viewport itself. So just to give you a quick overview of those. You see over here in this corner, we have the transform tools that I told you about before. These things over here are progrid settings. They're not generally something you'll need to pay close attention to unless you're doing something that requires you to snap them. Let's snap things at very particular intervals. But if there are grids showing up and you don't want there to be grids on your screen, just turn each of these off. This little toggle over here is our global local space switch, which does the same thing as the world space toggle on the Maker Pen. This over here is our pivot/center switch. If you've been messing around with the Maker Pen more recently, you would have noticed that the rotate tool has a rotate around pivot option, and you would have seen that Rec Room object can have pivot points. Well, the things that we work with in Unity also have pivot points, and this just changes whether you rotate something around its pivot or whether you rotate it around the dead center of all of the objects underneath a given object. these up here are our grid and our snap settings. These will you don't generally need to mess with these, but these will change the way that you see your scene. Just in case you want to see it without lighting or as wireframe, or you can't see something that's reasonably close to you, or if you've got a bunch of gizmos cluttering up your view and you want to turn them off, that's what this row of controls are for. The axis gizmo is something that we'll look at in a little bit more detail, just because it lets you choose which direction you're looking at your scene from. And finally, the perspective isometric switch switches between seeing things in perspective, which is normal, and between isometric, which is kind of closer to looking at grid paper. But I'll show you what that does in a second. Now this is Benchy. They are going to be our class mascot, but they are also the bearer of helpful screenshots and instructions on how we're going to go through our lesson content. I didn't put instructions in Benchy on how to import Benchy, so I'm going to run you through that now. But if you're following along with this afterwards, or you fall behind, there is a post in lesson resources called How to Import Benchy, and that will give you step-by-step instructions on how to bring them in. All you have to do is choose Rec Room Studio from this top little thing up here. I didn't put it on the slide, but for future reference, I'll be referring to this little section up here as the ribbon. So from the ribbon, we just choose Rec Room Studio, and that will summon the Rec Room Studio panel over here. Just to demonstrate, I'll close it and bring it open again. So this has changed in a recent update. Your Rec Room Studio panel now always opens on the right-hand side. It used to appear in its own separate window, but people found that confusing. So now it just lives here. So to open or create a room, all we have to do is press the Open a Room button here in the Rec Room Studio panel. Now, this gives us controls to do a few different things. If we search up here, it will filter the list of rooms that we have. But if we enter in something down here, it will be creating a new room. And so that's what we'll do here. Is just create a room, RRS, Speedrun, Test 2. You can call your one whichever you like, just make something memorable. And so if you hit create, initially you'll have created the room, but it won't open just because you created it. So once you've created it, then click on it, and then if you hit open, it will open your room. I'm gonna save this. No, I don't. Right. Sorry, let me turn on Do Not Disturb so I don't keep getting all these random notifications pop up. So back to the process of importing Benchy. Now that we have a room to import Benchy into, the default maker room starts in every new Rec Room Studio room that we open. You can delete or not delete this one at your discretion. So to import our friend Benchy, flick back over to our Lesson Resources channel. And we'll go to Lesson 1 Basics. And the last thing that we have here is our Lesson 1 Unity package. Now, Unity package is a format that we use to both import and export things from one Unity project to another. And it's a very useful way for getting your assets, resources, anything else from one project to another. And there are a few reasons that you might want to do that. If your project is just glitching out and you realized, oh, this project's broken and I needed to start a new one to fix it up, you can export a package of things from your broken project to your working project. That's just an example use case. But today, our package is going to help us by containing all of the instructions that we need for this lesson. So if you go ahead and hit download, show in folder for your download location. Now there are two ways that you can open this up. You can either double click this, but double clicking it isn't always reliable if you have more than one Unity open, which I normally do. But most people don't, and so if you've only got the one Unity open, double clicking on this should work fine. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'll show you the other way too, which is to go into Assets, Import Package, Custom Package. And then pull up the place where you downloaded the package. Usually that'll be in your Downloads folder, but I put it somewhere else because my downloads folder is really cluttered. So you go ahead and click open on that. Now this is something to keep an eye on when you import packages. I brought in this one, like I put together this one myself, so I know what's in it. But when you import packages from other places, like for example the asset store, if you want to know if you're only after a specific thing from it, this manifest will show you everything that's in here, and will let you check or uncheck different elements of the package that you may or may not want. But in this case, we want everything. Now, some of these are auto unhighlighted. That will happen if there are things in your package that you already have. But for the sake of the exercise, I'll say all. Now, if we go ahead and import our things here, once you've done the import, you'll see that there should be a new folder in your project panel down here. That's abbreviated to just RRSB because the entire name didn't fit. But if you double click on that, and then double click on the lesson 1 folder, now you'll see that we have two things in here, another folder and a blue cube. If you see something with a blue cube, that is a prefab. That means it's something that you can drag into your scene from the project panel, and it will immediately assemble itself into a collection of game objects. Which in this case is exactly what we want it to do. So if you click on it in the project panel, click and hold, and we're going to drag it into our scene. And voila, here is Benchy. Alright, so that's one thing that I should mention briefly. I don't want to go into all the intricacies between fast disks and slow disks now, but sometimes computers will have fast disks and slow disks. So they'll have like conventional hard drives or solid state drives. If you look up how do I tell whether my drive is an SSD or not and follow steps that you find, you can tell which of the drives attached to your computer are fast drives or slow drives. And if you can, put it on a fast drive, because if it's on a slow drive, there are things like importing that will take a hot second to do. If you have a look at your Benchy, we'll see that we've got, in the hierarchy panel, we have a new thing that says click the arrow to expand. And this is the part of our hierarchy that actually has Benchy in it. And this is what's going to have all of our instructions in it. Now, just to clarify, this isn't how a hierarchy is normally used, but you can use it that way if you want to. And especially for tutorials, I'll often use the hierarchy to hold a set of steps, so that you can get a good look at what we're doing. I'll pull up the slides again real quick, just to talk briefly about the concept of the hierarchy. The hierarchy looks like a folder structure, and like a folder structure, if you move a folder that contains a bunch of other folders, all of the other folders will move with it. Or it's a little bit like a tree and its branches. If you move the trunk of the tree, let's say theoretically you decided to sort of chop its roots off and move it out of the ground, all of the branches would move with it. And so would their branches and their branches. But if you decided to lop off just one branch and move it around by itself, then the branches attached to that branch, e.g. branch 1, would move around. But obviously branch 2 and 3 would stay where they are. But drag and drop is going to be our best friend in Studio. We do a lot of things with drag and drop. The most important use cases for it is if you, and I'll show you this, we'll be doing this again in a moment. If you drag something from the hierarchy into the project panel, you will make it into a prefab. If you drag a prefab or anything spawnable from the project panel to the hierarchy or into the scene, you'll spawn it in your scene. And if you drag and drop from the hierarchy or the project panel to the inspector, you will create what's called a reference. And I'll go over those in a little bit more detail later. But for now, I'll give you a quick overview on how we work with Benchy. So Benchy carries a bunch of little example screenshots on how to do things, just in case you get lost or if you're looking at this later on. So you can see this screenshot that it has here is instructions on how to activate other elements that are attached to Benchy. So in the hierarchy for Unity, an object can be either active or inactive. you can see that we have several of these that are a brighter color, and we have several of these that are grayed out. If they're grayed out, that means that they are inactive. Not only does that mean we can't see them here in the Unity editor, but if an object is deactivated in the hierarchy, you won't see it in Studio either once you try and local test or upload the room. So make sure if you want something to be seen, that it is set as active. Now, if you click on any of these little arrows in the hierarchy, you will expand them so that we can see the children of them. Now, one thing that this can be, there's a few reasons why this can be helpful. We can click and drag in order to reorder things in the hierarchy. It won't let us do this right now because this is a part of a prefab, and it doesn't like you to reorder things in prefabs. Unless you are editing the prefab, but we'll cover that in another lesson. But one of the most important navigation features we have is if you double click on an element in the hierarchy, it will snap you right to it. And so the base set of processes that we go through is, for each lesson, is we'll import our Benchy, and you'll see each of these will have numbered instructions. And now this first step was actually creating the room. We've done that already, so we can skip this step. But if you're satisfied that you've finished a given step, then click on the next step. It'll be grayed out. And just click this box on the right-hand side to activate it. This checkbox right here is a subtle one, but it's probably the most important checkbox in Studio. So take a mental note of where it is. That's how you activate an object. So now this one's active. If we expand it down, you'll see this is also instructions on how to open a room, which, again, we have already done. So we can skip over to step 4. And step 4 is a very important thing for any studio room, and that is putting down a welcome mat. Now, our assets that we have to work with in Studio fall into two distinct categories. Project assets, which are ones that we've put there ourselves or ones that we've chosen to import, and package assets, which generally the only package assets we'll be working with are the ones that Rec Room has given us to work with. Now there is one other set of assets that Rec Room's given us to work with, which is what's in this default assets folder, which is fortunately or unfortunately always abbreviated to default ARS. But if you click on them, there's a few different bits and pieces for us to play with in here. We have the Rec Room materials, we have the Rec Room soundtrack, and a few things like Rec Room rocks and Rec Room trees. So if you want to put Rec Room rocks or trees into your terrains, that's where they live. But the most important thing that we need in any studio room is a welcome mat, because as you can see, it doesn't start with one. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll spawn in our welcome mat. So you can see our instructions on Benchy tell us to click on this little search bar here on the project panel. It's only a subtle thing, but this search bar here on the project panel will save your life on multiple occasions. So if we type in welcome there, you'll see we don't see a welcome mat. We only see a Welcome to Cyberjunk City soundtrack. And that's because we're looking in our project resources, which is not where the welcome mat lives. So to find the welcome mat, we have to change our search to be in packages using this little pill here. So if we click on the in packages, if we have that highlighted, we can now drag a welcome mat into our scene. Now you can put your welcome mat where you like. I'll put mine into the maker room for the time being. And as per normal welcome mat rules, this is where you'll spawn. Now if you just dragged that out onto the screen like I did, your welcome mat will be a little bit under the ground. So this is where our transform tools come in handy. We can grab our little green arrow and drag them up to where we want our welcome mat to be. So at this point, our room is now spawnable. If we tried to either local test or upload our room before doing this, we'd run into some trouble. We spend a lot of time waiting in Studio, but the thing we spend the second most time doing is organizing. Because The only thing worse than waiting for your project to load is waiting for yourself to find something that you can't remember where the heck you put it. I've learnt this the hard way over multiple years. Keep your space organized. So to that end, the next little set of instructions that Benchy has for us is just how you create a new folder. And to do that, we, in our project panel, in any empty space, you'll see that we have a couple of views in our project panel. We have like our folder hierarchy view on this left-hand side, and we have our regular sort of file explorer looking view over in the middle. But if we right-click on any empty spot in here and choose Create, now the Create list is an intimidatingly long list, and for better or worse, we are going to be spending a lot of time looking at it. But folder, fortunately, is nice and easy to find. It's just this one up the top here. So it's a new folder. Now, you can name this in a way that makes sense to you, but I recommend starting it with an underscore or some other special character that will make it sort to the front. I usually call mine underscore project, and if you ever work with me on any studio things, you'll see a project called underscore project appear in your assets, because that's where I put my project folders to make sure that they stay distinct from everything else. Now you might be wondering what everything else is there to stay distinct from. There's a few things in here already, but every new thing that you bring in from the asset store is going to create its own little set of folders here. And the more you bring in, the harder it is to tell where your stuff actually lives, which is why I always create this underscore project folder. And then within that folder, I'll create a folder for any given project. So for this one, for example, I just call it RRS Speedrun lesson 1. You don't have to create your project folders without spaces. It should generally handle spaces, but there are every so often funny little edge cases where it does not handle spaces. That's another thing I should mention when you're creating rooms. There are some funny special character combinations that the room UI, that the Create UI in Studio will let you use. That Rec Room itself will not let you use, and it won't stop you from creating that room. You just won't be able to load into it. So just a warning, don't use special characters in your room names. So now that we've created this, now that we've created our file structure, we've got a place to put all of our bits and pieces. It's time for us to move on to our first proper importing task besides Benchy. So we'll go back into our inspector and we'll activate step 9, which has all the little flashcards that we need to import an image. Now I put them up here because we're going to be flicking through a few different things. So the first thing you're going to want to do, right? We can pull in images from anywhere, but in this case, we're pulling them in from Discord. And so if you got textures in a Discord chat or someone's like DM'd you a texture, this is how we'll work with them. So if you head over to lesson 1, the basics, and then we've got ourselves a handy dandy roll of duct tape, because duct tape fixes everything. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on it. We're going to choose Open in Browser. So this is a downloadable version of our duct tape, and I realized I've skipped a step here because the first thing that we do is we actually right-click here in our project panel. I don't know if you remember when I told you that our project panel view is pretty much just a file explorer view of our project. Well, that is exactly what it is. It's actually a file explorer view of where our project folder actually lives. And if you right-click in any empty space in the project folder, well, in the project panel rather, and hit Show in Explorer, it will actually open a Windows Explorer window telling you where your project is. Now, this is especially helpful when we want to bring things into our project, because anything that we put in this assets folder of our project, Unity is going to automatically pick it up and bring it in. So in this case, we'll click on our Speedrun Lesson 1 folder. Now this is the important bit of magic that we need here. At the end of this little pill list, we're going to click at the end of it. And that is going to give us an address. So we take this address and we copy it. You can either press Ctrl-C or you can right-click and press copy. And now over here, with our downloadable duct tape, we're going to choose Save Image As. And then once we've got that in here, we're going to click up the top, and we're going to press Control V. And so now, we've just teleported ourselves using that address to where our project assets live. And if we save it, you'll see it saves. Nothing appears to have happened at first. But if we flick back over to Rec Room Studio, it'll load for a second, and then you'll see something has popped up here in our project folder. So this is our duct tape that fixes everything. Now, you'll notice it's not actually, if we try and drag this onto something in our scene, it's going to do something a little strange, depending on whether or not it fits. So if I try and drag this onto Benchy, for example, it won't let me. If I try and drag it onto one of our little tutorial panels here, it actually will let me, but I don't want it to do that. So instead, we're going to create our own little plane to put it on, which is what our step 10 is. And you can see here, it has little instructions on how we're going to put a plane into our scene. So the Create menu in Studio, we can get to it from a couple of places. If you want to create something as a child of something that's already in the hierarchy, you can right-click and choose the thing that you're looking for from this list. But if you want to put it into the base scene level, we click this little plus button up here. And that's generally what I use because it's the most intuitive one. And we click this, and in this case, we're going to choose 3D Object, and we're going to choose Plane. And as you can see, it gave us a nice little flat surface. Or actually, in this case, a pretty big flat surface. Now, just for the sake of the exercise, we'll grab the Rotate tool, and we'll turn it around. Now, helpful thing to note with the Rotate tool, if you rotate it around normally, it will free rotate. But if you hold the Control button, it will snap, which is often the way that you want to actually be rotating things. Now, one little thing that we've been able to do in Rec Room on and off in the last little while, but currently can't. You can see over here in the inspector panel, now that we've got our plane selected, our inspector is currently inspecting our plane. And one of the first bits of information it tells us is what the position in space of it is, and what the rotation is. And so that's how we know that our plane is sitting straight up, is its rotation are all multiples of 90 degrees. Almost. I decided to be 90.3 for some reason. But a nifty little thing to do is you can type coordinates in here, and they will just instantly change. So if you want to make sure you've got your things all lined up in a row, that can be a nice way to do that. But now that we've got our cube rotated, our plane rotated to face us, this is the quickest way to get an image in. I will show you ways that we work with images in more detail in the next lesson. But for this one, which is just the quick and easy way, now that we've got a plane, just to clarify, this only works on planes. If we drag and drop our image from our project panel onto our plane, you'll see, voila, we have duct tape. You'll also notice that it's created a folder in the folder where the image used to live called materials. We'll be going over materials next lesson. But roughly speaking, materials, how it knows, how Unity will decide to draw the image that we've just given it. So that covered step 11. So one other thing that the search menu is helpful for is if you think you've put something in your project and you're not entirely sure where it is, you can search for it by name. In our case, the duct tape image is called Fixes Everything, so if we search for fix, we actually get quite a few different things. So sometimes you need to be a little more specific, but if we type fixes dash everything, you can see nothing showed up on mine, but that's because I'm still searching in packages. If we switch it to assets, we'll see that if I search for fixes, I'll get my duct tape showing up. All right. So in that case, we'll go onto our next step, which is to make it into an RR object, which is a perfect bridge for me to talk to you briefly about prefabs and the differences between the orange scene and the white scene. But the orange scene and the white scene, you would have seen them while you're looking for your project. There's a list of objects that are orange, and there's a list of objects that are either white or blue. Now the difference between these are the white scene objects are just a regular set of Unity scene objects. And when you upload your scene into Rec Room knows absolutely nothing about them. Like, they're there, you'll see them, and they'll do their thing, but we can't interact with them in any way. Besides the fact that they're there, we can step on them. Like, they are static. Whereas things in the orange scene are ones that actually get turned into objects that Rec Room knows what to do with. So a quick overview of the differences between these. Obviously, either one of them you can move inside of Studio. Orange scene objects you will be able to manipulate with circuits in your room. Also, you will be able to move with your Maker Pen. So just in case we decide we want to be able to sort of clone our duct tape later, or we want to be able to move them around with the Maker Pen once we're in our room, we'll take our duct tape and we will make it into an orange scene object. Given that it's currently a white scene object. Now, just to give you an overview of the idea of prefabs. You're all Rec Roomers, you've worked with inventions before. A prefab is like an invention, but a bit more of a magical invention, because it's an invention that you can go into and change after you've made it. Once you have made that invention, you can actually change it, and everywhere that you have placed that invention will be updated to reflect the changes that you made. So that's what a prefab does. It's useful for all sorts of things, because once we have something in a prefab, we can like mass place them on a terrain, or we can place many of them throughout our scene, change one, and it will update all of them. There's a lot of useful things that we can use prefabs for, but the most important thing is the only way you can bring something into the orange scene is if you put it in a prefab. So that's what we're going to go over right now. So usually I create a dedicated folder for prefabs. So if we go back into projects, into our specific project folder, usually I'll create a dedicated, hello, it stole my click. Okay. We'll create a dedicated folder and we call it prefabs. Navigate into that. Now literally anything over here in the white scene can be a prefab. I've never tried to make a prefab out of orange scene objects, but it's my understanding that in Rooms 2.0 you will be able to do this. But for now, we'll just work with things the Rooms 1 way, because this is not a Rooms 2.0 room. And so we take our plane that has our duct tape on it, and our instructions here would reflect. Well, they would. I actually forgot to put that one back in. But we can rename things in the hierarchy, which is great because plain isn't really a good description of what this is anymore. So if you want to rename something, you can either right-click on it here and press rename. You can double-click on it here and rename, but the most common way is to rename it from the inspector over here. So you click on it, click on the inspector on the right-hand side on that first little top bar, and we're just going to call this one duct tape. There you go. And so now our duct tape is ready to go. We're going to click on the duct tape in the hierarchy. We're going to hold our click and we're going to drag it down into this prefab folder. And you'll see that we now have this new asset type, and when we hover over it, it looks exactly like our duct tape does here. Now, another thing you'll have noticed is that the icon for our duct tape has now turned blue. It's now a blue cube instead of a wireframe cube. And so blue always means this is a prefab. And if you see a wireframe one, but its text is still blue, that means it's part of a prefab. Now, you can make some changes over the top of things that are in prefabs. You'll notice that over here in the inspector, most things that we want to change about stuff on our prefab members, it will actually let us change, but it will save them in the scene as an override over the top of our prefabs. So it's not the most reliable way to change things, but you can change them that way. But the most reliable way to change these things is inside the prefab itself. Now, if you've got a prefab with only one member, like we do now, you can actually highlight it in the project panel, and you can make changes in the inspector, and it will affect every instance of our prefab. So just to demonstrate, now that this is a prefab, just like Benchy, we can drag it out into the scene, and we'll get another one. And then let's say, for example, I wanted to change some property over here. I don't have any immediately good ones, but let's say for a second we wanted to make this invisible. If we uncheck the mesh renderer here, you can see both of our duct tapes disappear because we just made them invisible. But I'll show you the other way to deal with prefabs, just because we will be doing this a lot. And that's if you double-click on a prefab. We go into this strange blue void that has just the prefab in it. And this is called prefab editing mode. Now, the most important thing that you need to know about prefab editing mode is how to leave it, because that's not immediately obvious. To leave prefab mode, you click on this subtle little arrow that appeared in the hierarchy panel when we went into prefab editing mode. But now that we know how to leave it, any changes that we make here will be reflected in all of our prefab instances. And we can do the full suite of things, right? Like we can decide that, oh, I want to add a cube. Now, heads up, whenever you leave the prefab view, it will either prompt you to save or it will save it by default. But if you want to save it, you can just press Control S, or you can go File, Save. Now, this is another thing that I should have talked about before. Unity does not save your scene by default. If you see this little asterisk above it, that means you have unsaved changes. So go ahead and press Control S to save that right now, just in case, because you don't want to crash and lose all your progress. We don't actually want these cubes in the middle of our things, but you can see when I added it to our prefab, it showed up in all of the versions of this prefab that or all of the instances of this prefab we'd put into the map. So if we go back in here now and delete our cube, we can now perform the surgery, as it were, that will make this into an orange scene object. And that is to say, okay, we'll do one other thing to it first. The first thing we'll do is actually we'll search for box and we'll add a box collider. The reason for that is that in order for us to actually be able to move this with the MakeUp object, it has to either have a primitive collider, which I'll talk about components more in a future lesson, but just know that a collider is what actually lets the MakeUp pen hit something, or select something, or lets you stand on it as a player. And it's a Rec Room specific constraint that mesh colliders don't count unless they have this convex box checked. But just to be on the safe side, we'll add a box collider to this one. But now the most important thing that we can add to it is if we click Add Component and we search for Rec. That's all we need to do. All we need to do is search for Rec over here in the inspector panel, and we're going to click Rec Room Object. Why did I add an animator? Is that just here by default now? Sorry, this is new to me. Oh no, it's because I didn't actually add the right component, which is a little confusing. I clicked Animator Synchronizer by mistake. Animator Synchronizer is a really useful thing. We'll talk about that much later. But what we want here is the Rec Room object. Now, we will talk about all of the different buttons that are in here also in another lesson, but for now, it suffices to say that now that we have Rec Room object on this, and just to demonstrate this, I'll save the prefab. And you can see now, if we look for our duct tape here in the white scene, it is nowhere to be found. Instead, it now lives here in the orange scene, both of them. But if we wanted to take them back out of the orange scene, for whatever reason, we can click on the prefab, and in the inspector here, we can hit Remove Component, and it will move them both back to the white scene. Now you can do that remove operation from inside prefab edit mode as well. And for simple things, you can also add the RRStudio object back when you're in prefab mode.
Can you show how to make it a prefab one more time?
Sure thing. So just in case you missed that the first time, if we go through, I'll take this out of the orange scene again, just so I can de-prefab them, for example, instance. Oh, if you're wondering what I just did there, if you press Control D in Unity, it will duplicate whatever you have selected. and that applies to both things in the scene and things in the project panel and the hierarchy. So if we click on this, I'm going to choose Prefab Unpack completely to make this no longer a prefab. If you want to make it a prefab, just click on it, drag down into the project panel, and you've made a prefab. And then you can drag it out from there back into the scene. Now, if you try and delete a prefab, it'll warn you, because if you delete a prefab, you can see here, the object actually still stays in your scene. It just gets this little bit of red text saying, hey, the thing that I'm supposed to be based on doesn't exist anymore. So it just gives you that little warning. But now that we have these here, we can scale them down a little bit if we don't want our duct tape to be too big. You'll notice we have this great big setup, this great big black background on our duct tape. I'll show you how to remove that in the next lesson, unless we have like a burning desire to get rid of the black background on our duct tape now. But now that we've placed our duct tape and we've placed our welcome mat, we should be in a position to do the next thing. So we will have just followed all of the steps over here in step 12. But if you are following along after the fact, you can see each of these screenshots in Benchy. We'll give you the step-by-step specifics on how we actually go through and turn our duct tape into a Rec Room object. And now that we've taken care of those technical details, we can do something a little bit more exciting, and we'll import ourselves a custom skybox. So to do that, the screenshots here are a little bit vague because to import the skybox is the same process that we used to import the duct tape. And in this case, I'll create a little folder in my RRS Speedrun folder called Skybox. But you don't have to do that, but it helps to keep your project organized. If we go back over to Discord, you can see that this looks like a normal photo, but it looks like it's got a little more curvature in it than a normal photo might. And that's because this is actually what we call an equirectangular image, which is one that we can use as a skybox. So if we choose to open this one up, save as, with any luck, this will be opened to the same place we were in before, but I actually want to save it in the skybox folder, so I'll hit save. And now if I head to, now that this has shown up in my folder, the easiest way that we can make something a skybox is just by dragging it out into the sky. But if you see, it won't let me do that right away. And that's because there's a few different ways that Unity can treat textures, and not all of them let it become a skybox. So in order to tell Unity that this texture can be a skybox, we just have to click on it, and over in the inspector here, we have to change its import type. So whenever you click on an asset in the inspector that's an asset, you'll get this little set of controls in the inspector that tell Unity how it should actually bring it in. And the most important one you want to keep an eye on here is texture shape. So right now it's saying treat this as a regular image. We're going to say treat it as a cube. Now that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense initially, but what it means is, and you can see if you hover over it, texture is a cube map, which means it's information about how to paint a space that looks 3D on a 2D image. So we go ahead and click apply here. You'll see our little icon for it here changes into a sphere. And now if we drag it out into the sky, we do in fact have a sky. But you'll also notice that it looks a little bit blotchy, and we might want to improve the quality of it. Now there's two reasons that can happen. One is that you just have a low quality image. But there is another reason the sky can look a bit blotchy, or any of your textures can look a little bit blotchy. And that's because by default, Rec Room actually caps the resolution that they're imported at. And now to change this on our skybox, unfortunately we have to actually change it back to 2D temporarily. So I'll do that real quick. Now Unity's confused because it's like, hold up, I've got this material for the sky, and the picture that I have can't be a skybox anymore. I'm just going to paint everything gray. Don't worry, we're going to fix that shortly. But we can tell Rec Room Studio, hey, it's chill. Let this be a higher res texture. And we do that by going up to Rec Room Studio here and just clicking on Texture Import Settings. And from here we can check override default max texture sizes, and then we can bump our import up to something like 2048. So finally, now that we've got our skybox in, now you'll notice that even though I've updated the import resolution, our skybox still looks a little blotchy, and that's actually L on my part. I accidentally brought us in a skybox that's not a very high level, that's not at a very high resolution. But if we had one at a higher res, that would have fixed it. And you know what, even just for the sake of the exercise, I'll show you one other way that you can get things into your project if you already have them in a folder somewhere. And that's to say that if you have them somewhere useful already, you can just drag them from another folder into your project, and it'll just show up. And then we can do... I'll go through that same process just to prove that it works. You can see this file is much bigger. This is like a 6K texture, which we don't need. But I'll let it come in at least 2048, just for the sake of the exercise. And now that we have that, we can change its type back to cube. And apply. Now I can drag this out, and you can see that is looking a lot crisper. The reason this one has the cardboard square look is simply because it's a big image and Unity doesn't want to try and preview it. Now, if you're looking for more skyboxes, fret not. I will show you where I got this from. Some of you may have recognized where I got it from already. We'll cover that in just a minute. But now that we've got all of this set up, we can actually send it up to Rec Room. Now, we do have this little button up here that says Test Subroom. I will show you what to do with that in a future lesson. It does exactly what the name suggests, but it only works if Rec Room is open, and I don't have Rec Room open, so we're not going to go over it today. But if we open up our Rec Room Studio panel just by clicking Rec Room Studio again, and we hit Upload to rec.net over here on the bottom right-hand side. That does exactly what you'd think it does. It's going to go and upload what we have in our scene here over to rec.net. Now, this step can take a second, depending on how big your project is and how many new images you've added. In my case, I added a relatively big new image, so it can take a second. Okay, now this is a common thing that you run into sometimes. This is also entirely my fault, because I accidentally left a bad material on Benchy. Now we don't actually need any of these, so I'm going to go ahead and delete them. If we go ahead and hit refresh. Now what you just saw there was the error dialog. Anything that is stopping you from uploading your studio scene, and this will happen a lot, will show up in that dialog there. Sometimes it will give you the option to ignore, in which case you can just go ahead and press the thing anyway. But otherwise, you will need to fix things. And the fixing thing can be often what takes the longest. If you run into any problems there, feel free to reach out to me, or if I'm not immediately available, the Rec Room Studio Discord is also a very helpful resource there. Now here you'll see the screen that shows up here is the full manifest of everything that is currently in our room. Now most of these are just the tutorial images that are on Benchy, so you don't need to worry about them. But if your list is especially long and you're not sure why, that can be a good time to review what you've got in your room. The other important thing that you can do here is you can sort it by size. And just check whether you have any really big assets. It happens fairly easily. Sometimes you can accidentally bring in like one texture that's like sort of 100 megabytes, and you're like, why is my room so big? But you can check that here. As you can see, our Skybox is like a fairly chunky 8 meg, but we'll leave it in there for the time being. This text field down here lets you describe your upload. Now, if you're working with Studio, always, always, always name your saves informatively. In this case, I will just say added Benchy, Skybox, and duct tape. Now, good question, Rafe. You can turn any image into a Skybox, or it will at least try and make it into a Skybox. But it may not look very good. There's only images made in a certain way designed to be used as Skyboxes. But it will let you try and make any image a Skybox. But only images that have what we call an equirectangular projection will actually work, as will only those ones will look normal as Skyboxes. So just to finish up what we're doing over here, one thing that you'll want to check is hit this start build button. Rec Room made this off by default because their build servers were getting overwhelmed. And if you happen to just want to push something up so that other people can get to it and don't actually need to see it in Rec Room right away, you can leave that box unchecked. But for most of what we're doing, we're going to want to leave that box checked. And then finally, we can click upload. This can be one of the things that takes a hot second, depending on your connection. My poor Australian internet struggles with it a little bit sometimes. One thing you may notice is that there will be a discrepancy between the size of the files you're uploading and your room's final build size. Because what actually happens during this step is that for most Unity projects, if you want to build them for a different platform, like Quest, iPhone, PlayStation 5, you have to build your project for each of those individually. Fortunately, Rec Room has done that legwork for us, and when we upload these, we're actually uploading them to a build server, which will build this for every platform that Rec Room supports at once, which means we don't have to take care of that bit, which is wonderful. But the different platforms will get different levels of crunching on different assets, depending on how much memory space that platform is considered to have. And so by default, when you put something onto Quest or mobile, your textures will come in at only half their normal resolution. But the upshot of that is you will get different build sizes for your final upload, depending on which platform it's being built for. And I will show you how to check that just as soon as this up. There we go. So that's heading up there. Now you'll see, now that we've done that, we've got this little yellow icon over here. That means the build servers are busy processing our room right now. And it's not quite ready to go yet. So we'll give that thing a quick second to process. If we look at our Speedrun test 2, I decide to visit our room. And as you can see, here we are, Skybox and Benchy in tow.
Thanks everyone for joining. For more RRStudio content, make sure to join our class Discord server and check out our YouTube channels.